So, welcome back. Next up is Ela Leshem from Fordham Law School with a presentation called Laws Shifting Circles. Ela, you have the floor.
Great. Yeah. Thanks, Diana. Thanks to all the organizers. Thanks all for coming to the session. So, much of my work is about what you might call sort of borderline personhood cases. And so far, much of that has proceeded of case study by case study. You know, thinking about just sovereign persons, thinking about just corpses and the kind of personhood they have, or ships or fetuses. And this is a paper that is trying to take a step back from that and trying to see what kind of picture emerges once we put those different kinds of examples next to each other. So I'm not sure how much I'll get to, but I'll try my best. And one way into this topic, also what that picture is to start with what I use as a contrasting foil to what I then call laws shifting circles, which is the expanding circle story, in tribute to Peter Singer. And what I have in mind here is something, if you sort of apply it in the legal context, some sort of moral progress story that says, look, over time, we have given more and more entities moral recognition in our legal systems. We've recognized that more and more entities deserve moral consideration, are moral persons. This is a very US-centric way of drawing that circle, thinking about the franchise expanding, across classes, across races, across sexes over time. Obviously a work in progress, but what's interesting with this kind of story of the expanding circle applied to legal context is that you then see very different kind of legal advocacy groups and causes taking that story and trying to marshal it to say, okay, and here's what's next. So in line with the Peter Singer origins, one way of then saying, here's the next frontier is to say, well, non-human animals should be next. Or you take your father, other species too, ecosystems, or very different context, to take that story and say, no, obviously the next frontier is unborn humans, or again, this is fledgling, but we're seeing this emerge in advocacy spaces too, to say, on the horizon now are sentient AI systems. And part of what I find interesting about that use of the expanding circle story in many different contexts is how, even though substantively these groups and advocates are after very different things, and they rarely form coalitions politically with each other, rhetorically, they actually share a lot in common in sort of marshalling that kind of historical teleology. There's much more to say about sort of the kind of rhetoric and the historical arguments being used. I'm going to skip this because we won't have time, but so the historical warning that is issued by looking to particular examples of horrors of the past, and there are lots of ways to critique that sort of use of history. But what I want to focus on here is sort of a conceptual commonality that this kind of expanding circle story tends to share, which is that when it looks to the past, though as we saw, often not when it then looks to the future, it is very human-centric. If things about the humans we have given moral recognition to, the story also, when it looks to the past, tends to operate with a very binary understanding of personhood. You're either fully in or fully out. There's not much room for gradations. And I think as a result, and this is where we'll get to in a moment, the expanding circle story misses out on a host of entities that the US legal systems, I think this is true for other legal systems too, a host of agents, or I should say entities that have been recognized as moral agents by legal systems, and it also misses out on an even bigger host of entities that legal systems have recognized as moral patients in the past. So I'll get there in a moment. What is this broader universe of moral persons that I have in mind that I think this story overlooks and that are worth remembering. Well, to just give you a first sense of what I have in mind, I'll skip through most of these paintings. But think for a moment just of the entities that inhabited our societies over time. Demons, spirits, ancestral spirits, angels, gods. We can get into the disenchantment literature, Max Weber's thesis, and we'll get back to that. These are to a much lesser extent still with us than they once were, but I think that once we have this sort of openness to remembering those entities, if we now think about, let's say, the US legal system or other more modern legal systems, there is not just humans who are sort of central moral entities as recognized by the law. I see three sets of entities at the center historically of the US legal system. I call them God, country, man, to sort of invoke a 19th century triad. But what I have in mind here are the 19th century references of legal documents and others. But so, the sets here are human, what I would call superpersons. I'll explain that in a moment. Sovereign superpersons and divine superpersons. Now, why superpersons? I think because these entities have historically in the US legal system been recognized as having particularly elevated moral status. They get particularly robust legal protections, which is not to say that they're the only moral persons recognized by that legal system, right? Good argument that non-human animals have been in the set. I'm more skeptical, but some people would say corporations have been in that set too. But these three, that triad, are the superpersons, particularly elevated, and what they share, and this is part of what I'm very interested in this paper, is that they share a very special kind of power. You could call that their superpower, which is that it's not just the case that our legal systems have attributed dignity to them, and I'm using the word dignity because if you look at the US legal system at least, that is a go-to attribution to them. So it's not just that they have dignity, but it's also the case that they can rub off some of that dignity on objects that fall into their penumbras. I want to say more about what I mean in this next section by that. So if you now imagine the halos around the superpersons, they are objects that we closely associate with these superpersons in the language of semiotics. Those are the signifiers that are signifying the superpersons. What I have in mind, for instance, for human superpersons are corpses and effigies. What I have in mind for sovereign superpersons are things like flags and national monuments. For divine superpersons, things like sacred sites and religious artifacts. And once we think about those penumbra objects, very interesting sort of doctrinal parallels emerge. They get treated in very particular ways, which is that, I'll sort of simplify it, that it's not just the case that they get protected too. They get legal protections, they get venerated in certain ways. But it's sometimes even the case that they get personified in the legal system, again, in certain circumstances. Now, if that sounds weird, as so if you have troubles conceptually processing what that would mean to take an object personified, I think maybe for a moment about, just by analogy, of Catholic, Lutheran, or Eastern Orthodox church doctrines and the way the Eucharist is thought about. So the host, the Eucharist, is not just a symbol for Jesus, right? It's thought to be Christ's body. And in that sense, the host is this sort of personified object because it's the physical embodiment of that superperson, Jesus. And I think that kind of mechanism of personification we see play out in, for instance, the US legal system. But I don't think it's unique. And what happens in these cases of personification of penumbra objects, I then call them epipersons, because they now have personal status, and epi sort of signals that that personal status is derived from the superpersons. But what then happens in the law is that they're treated as moral patients. And I should have sort of paused, given that this is an agency conference, and said that for the superpersons, I think the legal system treats them as both, moral agents and moral patients. But now with these epipersons, the flags, the corpses, etc., there's no pretension that these are moral agents, but there is what you might call a pretension that they are moral patients, that they have interests, moral interests, and they're vulnerable to violations. And in particular, the interests that are attributed to them are, again, these dignity interests. That's the dominant language used when describing what's at stake with their vulnerability. And doctrinally, it's very interesting to see also patterns across these different superperson contexts of how they are treated as property. So on my concept, right, these are moral persons, in a sense. But they do have property status, except the property status tends to be very limited. What we end up seeing is that they can be owned, but only subject to a duty of care. So, like with corpses, for instance, you have very limited ownership rights in the US legal system over, let's say, the corpse of your relative, but only to dispose of your duty to bury it with dignity. And then we also see that for many, many of these epipersons, you can actually destroy them. That's one of your ownership rights. But you have to do so with dignity. So think again about the corpse, right? The corpse can be burned, it can be cremated, but it needs to be done with dignity. Or think about the flag, the American flag, which you can own as a private owner, but until the late 80s, you could not defile it and desecrate it, even though you were a private owner of your flag. Okay. The next parts of these are all you could think of as mini papers of what I'll walk you through now. I'll just throw them out here as claims, and then whatever you happen to be interested in, we can discuss more during the Q&A. But what's the picture that emerges when we have done this? We've sort of stepped back. We've seen the superpersons. We've seen the epipersons. We've seen the doctrinal shared features. Well, I think we get this picture where there's not just this, one circle and it expands. There are multiple circles, and they sometimes expand and they sometimes contract. This is really where the expanding circle story plays out, and it's a super important story. But it forgets about those circles where I think on the whole, it is the case that they have waned, at least in weight. You see the superpersons shrinking here. I think the penumbras have shrunk over time also in the human case. And fewer and fewer of these penumbra objects, I think, with time, are being treated as epipersons. But remembering this history makes us realize, I think, that this enchantment is not complete, though, in our legal system. That these superpersons, these other superpersons, and these epipersons are still more with us than we are otherwise tempted to think. In the US legal context, I'll just throw out some examples. Corpse abuse prohibitions in the criminal context, all sorts of venerated object statutes, heightened criminal penalties for violating those sets of objects compared to others, sovereign immunity, often justified in the US context based on the dignity of the sovereign. So there are all these remnants, I think, of the superpersons and the epipersons. Another implication is that I don't think there is this linear story of moral progress necessarily. There's not that simple teleology. Once you look at how these circles expand and contract over time, You start to see, well, you know, during the Cold War, let's say, God in the US legal system waxes. It's not this linear waning, because now you have the contrast with communist, atheist, Soviet Union, and in contrast to that, you suddenly get many more legal protections for certain kinds of invocations of God than you had beforehand. And no safe harbor, I think, is another implication. There's more to say there, but sort of just briefly what I have in mind is that there's not just a simple teleology we can rely on and say, if we're in moral doubt, let's just recognize something as a person, because we can sort of rely on that always being the right and the safe move. I think few of self-conceived rationalists would want to, with all of the entities that have been thrown out as examples, want to say, oh yeah, let's just grant personal status, because they're really difficult trade-offs that follow. And, you know, granting moral recognition to a corpse can sort of limit medical research. They're real costs to sort of just factoring everyone in. And so I think, you know, one of the reminders here is we need to get both things right, not just to recognize the entities that deserve moral personal status as moral persons, but then also to deny that recognition to entities we think don't have that status. And then, Deanna, how are we doing on time? 3 minutes. Okay, so it's like a minute each on abortion, AI, and rights of nature. So I think I'll just, you know, it'll be a sentence each. I think this all has, you know, it's not just with us doctrinally, there are these remnants, but I think this offers also ways to make sense, and I hope productive ways, of some of the personhood battles that we're currently fighting, at least in US society, but I know this is not unique to America. So rights of nature, one way to take this shifting circle story and apply it here is to say, actually, you know, there's more continuity here than we might realize in our legal system, because one way to understand what rights of nature advocates might be doing is that they're really operating with this divine superperson structure where nature is God, and then lakes and trees, for instance, should get similar kind of treatment as sacred sites and religious artifacts in the past. We can talk more about it. In the abortion context, one way to make sense of a certain kind of middle ground position, where, let's say, fetuses in the first trimester can be aborted, but in the US legal system often still have to be buried with dignity afterwards, the fetal remains, or where fetal homicide laws are still governing, is to say, oh, this is actually so operating in this epiperson framework, where basically this first trimester fetus is the mirror image of the corpse. It can be destroyed, but with dignity. It can be owned, but in very limited ways that are bound by duty of care. And AI, just skip. But you know, if you think about AI avatars, if it were the case that our legal systems start to say, you know, if something like an ex machina, a really human-like AI avatar, if that cannot be legally tortured, for instance, then we are, I think, again, potentially, and this is all thinking in a sort of non-sentient AI context, then we would be again in a sort of either sovereign or human epiperson context, where it's the continuity with a superperson that is really holding us back and giving us this sort of in-between status. Skipping. But I'll say, you know, at the end I had sort of legislative examples in the US context of how there are all these efforts now in various states to either declare certain things persons, typically fetuses, or to declare that certain things like AI systems, nature, animals are not legal persons. So there are all these anti-personhood statutes also popping up. And that's really, again, I think, so an outgrowth of this very binary approach to what personhood means, where we need to make the call of either in or either out, I'm hopeful that sort of stepping back and remembering that there are actually these other structures too, there are these epipersons, that might open up conceptual possibilities at least for understanding also what some of the middle grounds can look like. So with that, I'll leave it and I look forward to our discussion and your questions.